you introduce yourself?
So I'm Charlie Beestone. I am a performance nutritionist and performance lifestyle coach.
And what is your educational background?
So I have an undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science, a master's degree in sport and exercise nutrition. I'm on the register of sport and exercise nutritionists, and I have the talented athlete lifestyle qualification as well to be a performance lifestyle coach.
How are the nutritional needs of an esport athlete any different than the average person?
I don't actually think they are massively different, if I'm honest. I think they are more similar to the general population than they are to athletes in traditional sports, in terms of making sure that we look after their health, and then there may be some performance considerations as well, but we don't actually have that much research on what those may be as of yet.
Do you have any specific recommendations regarding the protein, carbohydrate, and fat intake for esports players?
So again, they will massively depend on what the esports player is doing, what their physical activity looks like, and what their goal is as well. So they may have body composition goals, they may have different performance goals with their exercise or with their esports. And what we do is generally we will tailor those to whatever the individual does, but also what their diet preferences are, and various things like that. Generally, for protein, we'd probably look at something like 1.6 grams per kilogram of their body weight per day, spaced out throughout the day. Fat can be anywhere between 0.6 to 1 grams per kilogram, depending on what their goal is. And then carbohydrates will really be matched to how much exercise they're doing and making sure that that's fueled and any competition is fueled as well.
Do you have any specific recommendations for the daily caloric intake in esports players? And what is the process for determining that?
Calorie intake will depend on, again, how active they are. So how we work out energy requirements is that we work out what their basal metabolic rate is in the same way we would for anyone. So we work out how many calories does this person need just to sustain life and to do all their normal life processes like respiration, maintaining different health of tissues like bone, muscle, etc. All those things we know we need for life. And then based off that, we then calculate what their calorie requirements are for the physical activity level they do. So if they're not particularly active on a day, say they are sat all day and doing no physical activity, then their energy requirements won't be much higher than their basal metabolic rate. If they are very active, training once or twice a day, then we'd work out what the requirements are for that activity as well and provide a calorie estimation that's based on that.
How important is hydration to an esports athlete? And do you have any recommendations for that?
So hydration is massive. We know that anything approaching a 2 to 3% loss in body weight of fluid has a negative effect on every cognitive and physical marker that we can measure, as well as potentially increasing their risk of injury if they are active, increasing their risk of getting infections, colds, etc. So hydration is actually really important. In terms of recommendations, a really easy place to start is something like 33 times your body weight in kilograms. This will give you how many milliliters that you need to drink per day on average. So if you were 100 kilograms, times that by 33, you'd need 3.3 liters or 3,300 milliliters.
How would you compare esports nutrition to traditional sports nutrition?
They're very different, but they also have some similarities. So when I mentioned with the macronutrients, for an elite athlete in a traditional sport, we're really looking to make sure that we can fuel whatever exercise and activity that they're doing. The numbers in terms of carbohydrate and total calories that they require will be much higher because they are much more active. One thing that we also look at with traditional sports is how do we separate making sure that their nutrition for their training, make sure that they get the most out of their training and they get the adaptation that we want. So whether that's increasing muscle mass, strength, cardiovascular fitness, all these different things that we get from training, we're using nutrition to get that adaptation and maximize it. And then also making sure that we get them ready for performance as well. So if they're competing in their given sport, we need to make sure that they're fueled to get through the whole game or event or whatever their sport is, but also to be fueled to perform as best as they can in that sport. So we're not quite there with esports in terms of knowing how we can best maximize their adaptation to training and practice, and then also to fuel in their competition, but that's where it will go in the future. So it'll be similar in terms of understanding what they need to perform and then making sure that we know how to fuel them for the performance as well.
What is the biggest challenge within the esports nutrition field?
The biggest challenge by far and away is the lack of research. So we don't really know anything. What we need to know in the future is what are the demands on esports athletes from a cognitive perspective and from a lifestyle perspective, what it is they're currently doing, And then once we know that, we can start looking at what are the recommendations that we give to an esports athlete to try and fit around this. So it's really the lack of knowledge, but also in terms of cognitive function, which is probably going to be the main thing for an esports athlete, we also don't know much about that in general and how nutrition can optimize that. It's really common for people to look at like supplements and nootropics and things like that to optimize cognitive function, but we don't actually know that much about the basics in terms of dietary patterns, best diets, best macronutrient intakes, those sorts of things, and how we can use those first to maximize brain function, cognitive function, and performance.
What benefits do you think a nutrition expert can bring to an esports team or an esports athlete?
I think it would be massive for an esports team to have a nutritionist on board. There's the really practical stuff of actually helping athletes develop better habits, to help them with their behavior change, which is a big area in nutrition. How do we actually change someone's behavior? We have to look at their underlying health and making sure that their nutrition is actually working towards keeping them healthy. If we can't keep them healthy, then they can't practice because they are not functioning properly. And also then looking at how do we make sure that they are performing the best of their ability when it comes to competition. So it's not massive at the moment, but I do envisage that most teams at the higher level will have a nutritionist on their staff in the future.
What esports performance benefits come with proper nutrition?
I think the main ones would be in terms of health. We know that actually if you're not healthy, that affects your cognitive function. So for example, if in gut health, if we don't look after the gut with correct diet, with enough fiber, with enough variation in the diet, that actually has a negative impact on brain function. It's linked to different mental health issues like depression and anxiety. And so straight away, by looking at one area of the body, we can actually have a positive impact on cognitive function. So there are so many different ways that nutrition impacts performance for the esport athlete, but health is the first one. And I think in the future, we'll start looking at how to optimize their performance as well.
Do you recommend any supplements for esports athletes?
So I think caffeine could be used if it's used appropriately and dosed and timed appropriately as well, is one that probably has a good evidence base for having an improvement in cognitive function. Creatine monohydrate is one that not many athletes will be using for esports, but we have really good evidence that it provides energy for highly energy demanding tasks mentally. So if someone's sleep deprived, if they are hypoxic, so they've got low oxygen, if they've got really hard decisions and mental tasks to do, we know that creatine actually improves those things. So amongst all the other benefits that creatine monohydrate has, it's really beneficial for an esports athlete. Omega-3 fish oils are probably another one in terms of reducing inflammation, and it's been shown to have some positive effects on cognitive function as well. And probably vitamin D is the other one that I consider, because a lot of esports athletes will spend a lot of time inside and therefore are likely to be deficient in vitamin D.
And then you touched on the caffeine a bit. Do you really have any other opinions on caffeine intake?
We have to be careful to make sure that it doesn't affect sleep first and foremost. So caffeine will, the half-life of caffeine, so how long it will take for half of it to have cleared from the blood, is around 8 hours or more. So if an esports athlete is taking caffeine in the afternoon, chances are that's going to affect their sleep, which will have an effect on their health and their energy intake and their nutrition in the longer term. So we need to make sure that we're not affecting sleep with caffeine. And then also, I think we're going to start playing around with different types of caffeine. So whether we look at coffee, energy drinks, tablets, powders, but also chewing gum, which we know works slightly quicker. So that can have some use in esports as well. So I think we need to be careful with the total amount that an esports athlete is consuming per day, the timing of that, and then making sure that the recommendations that we give to them in terms of when and how to take caffeine are in line with the research that we have, and that it's safe for them to do so.
Is there a specific amount of caffeine that's recommended?
So something around 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of their body weight seems to have an effect on cognitive function. Going higher than this probably isn't necessary. So somewhere between 1 and 3 milligrams. So if you were a 70 kilo athlete, something between 70 milligrams and 210 milligrams, I'd start at the lower end and then work up depending on how much caffeine you usually have, and then go from there really. And if 70 milligrams isn't having as much of an effect, then possibly aim for the higher end of that recommendation.
What is the recommended daily nutrition schedule and the typical esports athlete?
So that will depend, as it does with all athletes, on what their schedule looks like in terms of training, competition, when they have food available. All these different things play into when we actually eat. There's some research looking at time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting for cognitive benefits. And there is some early research in humans saying that might have a benefit, but I don't think we're quite there in terms of making a really solid recommendation that all esports athletes should be doing this. And it's certainly not the first thing that I'd look at for an esports athlete. So if we look from a behavior change perspective, we just need to look at what they're doing now and change little bits around their schedule rather than overhauling their schedule and making them eat at a completely different time, because that's not going to be sustainable for them. They won't be able to adhere to that. So there's potential benefit in the future for looking at when's the best time for them to eat, what are the different effects of eating at different times or in certain windows. But for now, looking at their schedule as an individual on a consultancy basis and then making sure that we can make changes that work for them.
Do you have any recommendations for snacks in between gaming breaks or before gaming?
So it will depend on what the day looks like in total and how we can work within that. During competition, there's some argument for glucose because we know that low blood sugar will affect cognitive performance. So depending on the duration of the task and how many games and how long the games last for, something with fairly simple sugars might work. So dried fruit, for example, would be a really good one. Sometimes it can be something that you need to fill you up. So something higher in fiber, so some nuts can be really good, or some other protein sources like meat, cold meat, etc. It will really depend on what the day looks like for the athlete and what their schedule is, and then how we fit around that.
Do you think it's realistic for someone to work in esports nutrition full time right now?
I don't think so. So if we look at traditional sports, there are only a handful of teams and sports that have a full-time nutritionist on staff. Most of the time it will be people working in multiple different teams for 2 or 3 days a week on a consultancy basis. And I imagine that's how esports will work, in that some nutrition will have 2 or 3 days of consultancy at different teams potentially, and then possibly look at the research using those teams and how do we publish more research and add to the evidence base that we already have at the moment. So I don't think it'll be full time, but I think there is definitely scope for nutritionists to work at the top tier with those teams.
And do you think that is going to change in the future?
Possibly. I don't think so. I think it will always be a 2 to 3 days per week, but it will depend on the level of the team and their budget, really. I think there's enough work for nutritionists to do working full time within a team, but based on budgets and priorities for the teams, I think it will be more on a consultancy basis 2 or 3 times a week.
What advice do you have for anyone who is looking to work in esports nutrition?
First of all, chat to me because I'm really interested in working in it as well. I think you really do need to have a decent understanding of the fundamentals of nutrition, how they work. Really try and get your head around the different markers of cognitive function and how nutrition affects those different things, but also have some experience of working with people, because the challenges that esports athletes might face might be quite unique and require some different strategies from the nutritionist. So if you're going into it with your first role in nutrition, you might find that there are some barriers and challenges. So if you're just starting out in nutrition, looking to work in esports, I'd recommend looking at working in other sports as well and with general population people, because you'll learn a lot from those people on the different barriers and challenges that people face with their nutrition, and then how to overcome them and how to apply those to esports athletes.
And is there any degrees or any certifications that you'd recommend for them?
I really do recommend having an undergraduate in at least some sort of sports degree with like a biochemistry focus. So I think really you should have some underpinning nutrition qualification before, so a degree, potentially a master's. There are other diplomas out there, depending on the country you're living in, that you can look at that might give you some understanding of nutrition, but it's not, because of how many different things we can affect and how many different factors there are, it's not something that you can just do a little bit of your own research and then start recommending things to athletes, because what we recommend does affect someone's health and can be quite serious effects on those people's health as well. So really important that you get an understanding of how the science works and how the body works before you start going and working with those people with their nutrition.
How can people get in contact with you?
So I post more stuff around cognitive function and brain health on LinkedIn and Twitter. So if you just search for my name, you'll be able to find me on those 2 places.
Okay, thank you for your time, Charlie.
Brilliant. Thanks, Russell.